In his prison cell, P. Diddy cries every day, barely eats, and has lost over 22 pounds. Most nights, he stays awake, staring at the ceiling, seemingly consumed by regret. This is the account of a prison guard working in the wing where Diddy is being held, awaiting his trial. The following report gives an intimate and unsettling view into Diddy's daily struggles, from the moment he entered the jail to the overwhelming emotional toll he has endured since. The guard recalls the day Diddy arrived, an overcast morning, the kind that made everything feel heavy. Word had already spread among the security team that Diddy was coming. The man who had everything, fame, fortune, power, was about to enter a completely different reality. The guard confesses to feeling curious about how Diddy would handle this new life. When the van arrived, Diddy was handcuffed like any other prisoner, with no flashing cameras or crowds. There were only the heavy sounds of the gates closing and the silence of someone on the verge of being forgotten. Diddy, dressed in the standard inmate uniform, looked smaller than the towering figure known to the world. There was a look in his eyes that spoke volumes. He seemed unable to believe that this was happening to him. He wasn't the cocky, confident man from TV or magazine covers. He was just another person caught in the machinery of the justice system. There were no complaints, no outbursts. He walked slowly to the processing room, his head lowered, almost resigned to his fate. When Diddy was taken to his cell, the other inmates watched from behind bars. Some shouted taunts, but many were simply curious. How could the man who had once seemed invincible end up here? Diddy's slow, heavy steps told the story of a man who had just experienced a devastating fall from grace. That first night in the cell, the guard passed by multiple times, and each time he noticed Diddy sitting on the bed, his head down, staring blankly at the small window in the cell. It seemed as though he was looking for something, perhaps answers or a glimpse of freedom. He didn't lie down. He just sat, as if the weight of everything had drained him. The following day, the harsh routine of prison life began. Inmates were required to get up early, go to the cafeteria for breakfast, and then move on to their daily tasks. Diddy struggled to adapt. In the cafeteria, he took his tray but ate very little. He barely interacted with anyone and spent most of his time sitting in silence, staring at his food. Prison life was a shock for him. The guards and prisoners knew he was struggling, but there were no special treatments. Everyone was treated the same. As the days passed, Diddy's physical and emotional deterioration became more apparent. He seemed increasingly disconnected from the world around him. In the courtyard, while other inmates exercised or talked with each other, Diddy stood alone, staring at the walls. He seemed to be in another world, consumed by thoughts that he couldn't escape. The biggest shock for him was the lack of privacy. Inmates here have no freedom. Cameras are everywhere. Guards are always alert, and even phone calls and visits are monitored. Diddy, who was once accustomed to privacy and control, now found himself exposed and vulnerable in a way he never imagined. The emotional toll on Diddy deepened as time went on. He began to cry in his cell at night, something not typical in a place where weakness is often met with ridicule. His sobs were low and constant, filled with despair. He seemed to have lost the will to fight. In the courtyard, he would retreat to the farthest corner, isolating himself from everyone. When others tried to approach him, he mumbled short responses or nodded without saying much. This isolation only seemed to exacerbate his feelings of loneliness and despair. Physically, Diddy began to deteriorate rapidly. In just a few weeks, he had lost over 10 kilos. His body became frail, his clothes hanging loosely on his thin frame. He seemed malnourished and fragile, a stark contrast to the confident, powerful man he had once been. The food in prison wasn't gourmet, but it was enough to sustain most prisoners. For Diddy, though, it wasn't about taste. It seemed that he couldn't even force himself to eat. During mealtimes, he would take a tray, sit in his usual corner, and stare at the food, barely taking a bite. By now, it was clear that Diddy wasn't just suffering from the harshness of prison life. He was spiraling emotionally. His health declined, and even the other prisoners noticed. Some made mocking comments, but others could see that Diddy was dealing with something far more profound. He seemed to be trapped in a state of constant regret and self-doubt. Often, the guard would hear him muttering to himself in his cell, repeating phrases like, "I should have done it differently," or "none of this was worth it." It was clear that he was wrestling with the consequences of his past decisions. the lack of support from the outside world only deepened Diddy's emotional collapse. During the first few days, there were a few visitors, but they stopped coming. His visitor list became almost non-existent. The guard remembers seeing Diddy waiting for someone who never showed up. Diddy would sit in the visitor area, looking at the door with a sense of longing, but no one came. This abandonment added to his growing sense of isolation and despair. During his rare moments of solitude, Diddy would look at photos, perhaps of his family or the life he once had. His expression would change as he looked at them, longing, regret, and an unspoken sadness. One night, he asked to use the phone, but when the call ended, he looked even more dejected. He had tried to reach out, but once again, no one was there for him. At night, Diddy's anxiety seemed to take over. The guard would often find him sitting up in bed, staring at the floor or the ceiling, unable to sleep. He was haunted by nightmares. Muffled screams, heavy breathing, and fearful murmurs filled the quiet of the night. It became clear that the impending trial weighed heavily on him. Each day brought him closer to facing the consequences of his actions, and the fear of what was to come consumed him. He would mutter to himself things like, "I'm not ready," or "They're going to destroy me." Even in his rare moments outside of his cell, Diddy appeared completely lost. He would sit in the courtyard, staring at the high prison walls, not searching for a physical escape, but seemingly trying to make sense of how everything had gone wrong. He no longer looked like the man who had once ruled the entertainment world. He was now a shadow of his former self, overwhelmed by the consequences of his choices. The transformation Diddy underwent from the man who had everything to the broken individual he is now is both shocking and tragic. Prison life, with its brutal realities, has not just affected his body but his mind and soul. Diddy is no longer a star. He's just another inmate, struggling to find a way forward amidst the overwhelming regret and emotional collapse that he is facing. The weight of his decisions is too much to bear, and it's unclear if he will ever find peace, inside or outside these walls.